Welcome. I'm Jack Churchward, and thanks for joining in my research into the lost continent of Mu and ancient advanced civilizations. These podcasts are created as the need arises, but you can catch more information reading the my-mu.com blog or visiting the my-mu.com website. I'm honored today to have as my guest Dr. Jeb Card of Miami University. Dr. Card has examined 4 of the 2,600 tablets discovered by William Niven in the Valley of Mexico. These were identified by my great-grandfather James Churchward as being Nacal tablets from the lost continent of Mu. My recent book, The Stone Tablets of Mu, discusses the history of these discoveries. I first heard Dr. Card on the Archaeofantasies podcast. His research into what he calls the Mu stones is fresh insight into an undisclosed chapter of North American archaeology. Dr. Card, thank you for joining us today. Could you please tell us a bit about your background and your research into the Mu stones?
Yeah, thank you for having me. And first off, I have talked about these on the Archaeofantasies podcast, and I just want to note that I am actually now a co-host of that. And so I'm on there every other week, not as a guest, but as a co-host. So, but there is an episode out there, and we'll probably talk about some of the same material. And I've actually done, and we had talked about this, an update on them very briefly, because it ended up being less interesting than we thought. But anyway, I'm a visiting assistant professor at Miami University in Oxford, Ohio, so not in Florida and not Oxford in England, but it's got the same names. It's very old. We were founded in 1809, so we see kids around here wearing T-shirts saying that Miami was a university when Florida was still a Spanish colony, which is quite accurate actually. Mm-hmm. But I study various and sundry topics in Mesoamerica as an archaeologist, and my doctoral work was on the first Spanish settlement in El Salvador, which intriguingly actually kind of gives me a little bit of insight into some of these topics, like the idea of hyperdiffusion, like what a foreign colony would look like, because I actually studied the first Spanish one in El Salvador, and what that does look like in comparison to pre-Hispanic Mesoamerican sites. But I've done that. I've worked on some classic Maya things. I actually have a couple of papers coming out on classic Maya stuff, including some hieroglyphic stuff. And I don't want to talk about that too much. I have presented on it a little, but since the major paper is almost through revision, I kind of want to leave that be. But I have a background. I went to Tulane University for my doctorate, which is historically very well. It's got like a deep history with Maya archaeology. I'm at Miami now. And so I don't want to just keep going, but you asked to talk about the Mu stones. So basically, a couple of years ago, I was going through. We used to have a anthropology museum here in the 1950s. A large donation of about around 8,000 artifacts, if I remember correctly, was donated to the university. And at that time, there was not an anthropology department. There was sociology, gerontology, and anthropology. And I think we maybe had like 1 or 2 at the most anthropologists. But there was a guy who grew up here in Oxford by the name of John Coulter, and he went and became he went to school here also. He went to Miami, and he went and became a vice president of the Colgate Palmolive Corporation. And so he was well off. I don't know if he was rich or anything, but he did well enough for himself. And he traveled around a bit, and he became very fascinated by archaeological artifacts. And so he collected materials from all around the world, especially the Americas, although he did have some things from Indonesia and Europe, but most of his things were from the Americas. And so on his death in the late 1950s, that collection was donated to the university and became the core of our museum. Now, we have some other people who donated a little later, but that's the bulk of it, and that's the important one for our discussion. And so in preparing, well, eventually we don't have a museum now. We have the materials, but the space that was a museum is now teaching laboratories, which are actually under construction right now. But teaching laboratories, and so what we use the materials from the museum to teach hands-on. All of our students in our courses actually handle real archaeological artifacts. And so I've been managing. That's actually part of my job here is to deal with these collections. And I think, yeah, it was 2 years ago, if I remember correctly. I was prepping for some exercises for a course on culture, art, and artifact. We're going to deal a lot with looking at this guy, like looking at who he was, where did these things come from, and sort of using that as an example to understand archaeological heritage. And I started looking through our records. And I had, worked with a number of the artifacts, had worked with some of the records, but, there's a lot. So I had not worked through everything by any stretch of the imagination. And I came across a reference in the records that just made me literally jump out of my chair and run down and find them. And I actually had seen them in the basement, but it kind of slipped my attention as to what they were. And I actually have the catalog entry right here, if I can get this file up. My computer's acting really slow today for reasons I don't really understand. This is really annoying. There it goes, populating now. Sorry about that. All right. Handwritten, I believe around the 1950s, Reese specimens MX530 ABCD. These are four of a collection of 169, I don't know where they're getting that number, although we can talk about maybe where, river/rare stones. It's just hard to read. Alleged to have been found by William Niven, an amateur archaeologist of Mexico City in the area of, and they misspell it, but Azcapotzalco, claiming them to be earliest form of glyphs. Refer to The Lost Continent of Mu by James Churchward, published by Joe Washborough in 1931. Therein will be found reference to the, quote, glyphs, connecting these with tablets found in an Indian monastery and confirming the author's theory with reference to the Lost Continent of Mu. And I did know what that meant. One of the things I do research on, in addition to my archaeology, Spanish colonial archaeology, other things, is I'm kind of looking into sort of the kind of weirder and wilder side of archaeology, like why archaeology sort of has a reputation. You go on History Channel, it's all, it's not people digging through the dirt to find pottery to understand humans of the past. It's ancient aliens. It's any number of, of different topics, and that's not the only place, and it's not unusual. So I'm actually working on a number of publications and books about why that is. And so I'm very familiar with these sorts of things. And I had read about these 20 years earlier or 20 some years earlier in Stephen Williams's fantastic Archaeology, which I don't have a copy of with me here, but it was 1991. I think he's a professor at Harvard, and he had talked about these stones, and he actually had a picture of them. And so I knew about them, and I was intending to write about them in some minor capacity. And then I realized we had some. And so I ran downstairs, and there they were. I mean, as soon as I read this, like, oh, that's what those are. And found them and actually 3D scanned them, because I was afraid it was going to end up like a movie in the Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, where if I left them here overnight, they would disappear in the morning or something. Yeah. That sort of began this, where they came from, and then we can sort of talk about maybe how they may have gotten here, et cetera. But that kind of begins the story.
And so you have looked them over.
I have them on my desk right now, actually. Yes.
And I have to, at this point, thank you for the 3D copies that are in front of me as well.
Yep.
And
yeah.
I'd like to, what type of tests did you put them through?
All right. Well, first off, most of my research has been looking into, are they what they are? Where did they come from? And so the basic thing is, so William Niven was a Scottish-American geologist turned archaeologist. Although by geologist, I'm not saying he didn't necessarily know geology, but a lot of what he did was basically rock hunting, was basically like finding gems, and more of an engineer. Not as much of a research scientist, more of a prospector type. And he went down to Mexico starting to look for rare minerals for various people in museums, and then got interested in archaeology. And so by the 1920s, he had become the biggest sort of commercial digger in Mexico, certainly the biggest vendor, and he sold artifacts left, right, and center to all different kinds of individuals, especially foreigners, museums, other things like that. And I've now looked into him heavily, and actually one of the main sources for this is, and I don't think my copy is here, so I'll have to see if I can find a citation. But it's or if you know the book off the top of your head,
Buried
Bob
Cities,
Wicks's book.
Forgotten Gods.
Yes, and it's Robert Wicks, and I'm blanking on the co-author. Is actually what I was looking for.
Harrison, who was his grandson.
Yes, Niven's grandson. And so and weirdly enough, Bob Wicks is the head of our art museum. But because the people before me were a little sort of secretive and sort of knowing what was out there, or maybe they didn't realize Dr. Wicks's interest in this, those two had never come across. Dr. Wicks now knows of these, but until I found them in the basement, he was not aware they were here. But a lot of our artifacts, or at least a significant chunk of the ones from Mexico that Coulter bought or got his hands on and donated to the university eventually in the 1950s, came from Niven. So like I have notebooks that are like Niven this, Niven that. So first of all, there was that element, like the historical, like where's our documentation, et cetera. And so went through that. But at one point, I actually did also take them down to our microscopy lab downstairs, one of our microscopy labs, and they did X-ray diffraction and basically got chemical elemental composition. Because I wanted to see if there was any evidence of any sort of artificial materials, like, if it was a lead-based paint. I mean, I don't believe these things are older than the 1910s or 1920s. I believe they were made, and we can talk about maybe who exactly ordered them and who made them. But if we were able to find like an obvious chemically based store-bought paint, that would, of course, be a slam dunk. And long story short, we actually did not. We initially were impressed by the fact that there was a little bit of titanium in elements, but that would actually show up in these sorts of igneous materials. These are basically pumice. They're basically fairly fragile, kind of volcanic, what's called poma in Spanish. And it can be of any number of materials. It's not like it's not like, pure gold is pure gold. It's basically just any number of conglomerates that, and I'm not a geologist, so I don't want to get into all of that, but that are found in volcanic deposits. I mean, I've run into this stuff in El Salvador. You run into volcanism when you do archaeology in Mesoamerica, but especially in places like El Salvador, central Mexico, where these things were obtained by William Niven. So we did do that kind of chemical analysis, but I also went around and found some more. So it was known to me, because one's actually depicted in Williams's book, since he was at Harvard. The Peabody Museum, until I found these, the Peabody Museum at Harvard had the only ones that were openly known of. And I don't know how much you've talked about. I mean, you've talked about these obviously on previous podcasts, but at one point there were at least 2,600, and then they all, in essence, kind of vanished. But 6 were known at the Peabody. You can actually go to the Peabody Museum's website, and it takes a little bit of doing, but you can find images of at least 3 or 4 of them. And then a couple more are there, but I'm not sure all the images are online. But other than that, until I started doing this research and finding these, those were the only ones that I think were known. And you'd be the expert on that, I think.
Well, actually, I hadn't found them. You had to point them to me.
Oh, okay.
And I have requested permission to have them displayed on my website, on my blog, so that other people can see it. But other than that, I'm still waiting on permission.
Okay. So. I have some feelers out, and again, I don't know if I can get into this because it's other institutions, but we have been able to locate a couple of others. I mean, literally a couple, like 2 more, in other institutions. And I am going to publish on that. And I think when those are ready to go, I'll be able to talk about that a bit more. But that would pretty much put the total that are known, although I guarantee there's more out there, at 6, a dozen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Now, You've talked about the ones, and if you look at Dr. Wicks's book, there are those pictures. Like there's that great picture of the shelving with, there's a couple of hundred, or at least about 100 in that image. The ones that Harvard has, the Peabody ones, look like they're the larger kind of rectangular ones. The ones that we have are the smaller little cobbles. And there are examples of this. In fact, there's a numbers about 30 or 20 or 30 in the image that look like them. And while these don't have, and we've talked about these don't have the specific. Well, they might actually. Now that I'm looking at them, so I'm holding them right. No, they're not. These are our museum numbers. They don't have numbers from Niven or Churchward on them. But if you look at that picture, for example, number 350, I don't have number 350, but you can tell there's one of them you have that's got basically a flower design on it that looks a lot like that one, and it's probably about this. It's probably about the same size, and the style is very similar. I should have brought my copy of Bob Wicks's book in, because there's an image in there, and I've sent the page number to you that's got like 3 or 4 of them, and the style on them is pretty much identical to the 4 that we have. It certainly looks like the same kind of carving.
So, as far as, so you don't believe that they were made prior to Niven's discovery of them, or maybe made just a few weeks prior?
Well, I don't know about weeks. I mean, well, the thing is, he was digging there for years. So he was digging there for years. I mean, no, I do not believe they're pre-Hispanic. And let me lay out a couple of reasons. Let me lay out the biggest reason why. And this is something, and I don't know if you've talked about any of these. I know you're familiar with them. I don't know if you've talked about them on your podcasts. There is a pattern where you'll get one claimant, and they will have the only examples, and they may have a lot. They may have hundreds or even thousands of an example of a particular kind of material culture. That's not what we find in archaeology. So, I've worked on classic Maya sites. I've worked on colonial sites. And what you find, I mean, yes, you occasionally find one-off unusual objects. Oh, even then, they are typically able to tie them in. So you find, there's only one, Pakal the Great, the sarcophagus of Pakal II at Palenque. He's falling into the maw of the underworld. It's the one that's people like Eric von Daniken were like, oh, it's an astronaut. Well, it's not, because in fact the reason we can say that is, while that's the only one like that, elements of it are clearly found in other monuments. Like, it is part of classic Maya sculpture, of which there are hundreds and thousands of examples. I dig at a Spanish site, I find little figurines that are not that common, but you do find them in central Mexico in colonial context. In other words, you find pottery at one place, you find it elsewhere. You find carvings one place, you find it elsewhere. You find architecture one place, you find it elsewhere. Because this is how material culture generally works if you're talking about stuff that's made by more than one person and used for more than a couple of years. You find this pattern, though, with frauds, with hoax objects, where it will only be one person who ever finds them. And so the Acambro figurines, for example, in West Mexico, are these clay little dinosaurs and other weird figures, and there are like thousands of them, and they were being purchased by I think he was a salesman, I think a hardware salesman, and it turns out they were almost certainly being made by local farmers, and they were selling them to him. I think it was Valdemar Ulesrud. And this is a very similar case. No one else digging in West Mexico finds these things. They're only found by the one farmer that happens to have thousands of them. Or the Ica stones in southern Peru, which again were bought by a doctor, and they're carved in, and there's a lot of controversy back and forth. The guy who apparently made them ended up confessing, but then people are like, well, he confessed because he didn't want to get arrested for looting real things. So the problem is he's the only one who generally finds those. And it's the same thing with Niven. No one else finds anything that looks like these. Now, he found a few things that look sort of similar in West Mexico, and it's only him which makes it even more questionable. Although how similar those things he finds are, like these various plaques and whatnot, is hard to say. But if other people were, other people were literally digging at the same sites he was. And in fact, Manuel Gamio, who was the sort of lead archaeologist in Mexican archaeology at the time that Niven was digging right nearby. And they were finding the same kinds of Teotihuacan pottery and same kinds of stone tools and same kind of figurines, but none of these things. No one else finds these things. And that's an immediate red flag. The second thing is you've seen them. They're pretty crude. And he talked about them being found under like a 10,000-year-old volcanic layer and all this. Not only are they very crude, they're really fragile. The material is extremely fragile. Like you could carve it with a butter knife. It's not hard material at all. And the fact that they're all in very good condition, like I've never seen a picture or an illustration from Niven's where they're in fragments. I find that almost impossible. I find that impossible to believe. It's not even almost impossible. I find that something that's 10,000 years old, that you have thousands of examples of, every single example of them is whole and they're fragile. That makes no sense whatsoever. Whereas normal things you find archaeologically, people think that we find like whole pots. That happens every once in a while. It sometimes happens more commonly. In fact, if you go to a museum and you see a really nice, beautiful whole pot, it is almost certainly from a burial, because that's the only place you generally, not always, there are exceptions, of course, but the vast majority of things we find are shattered because they've been dealing with thousands of years of nature, of gravity, rocks, earthquakes. We're talking about Mexico City. Mexico City has lots of earthquakes. So these things have been there supposedly, if you believe what's said about them, for over 10,000 years in an earthquake zone made of fragile materials. Not one of 2,600 is broken. That's a massive red flag. If you look at the designs, not all of them, and you can actually see this on the ones I sent you, while some of them are square and they just sort of have designs, any number of the ones that are more unusual in shape, the designs very much follow the contours of the rock. Not always, not every example, but most of them. And that again makes me think they got a rock, they quickly carved it, and not one is broken, So, and the rocks they're on are often very rough. So like the copies I sent you, they're basically just sort of chunks, and yet the designs on them follow the lines of the chunk, which again just screams that they're fairly new. These are all the sort of things that we have seen time and again around the world. You find other examples where they're too good to be true in some ways. They're often highly symbolic. With so again, a lot of hoaxes are like they're not nobody hoaxes broken cookingware, nobody hoaxes broken stone tools, although that sometimes does happen, but most of the time it's look, it's hieroglyphs, it's something that's going to attract the imagination of sort of a late Victorian idea of archaeology being ancient writings, carvings, sculptures, quote unquote idols. These are the sorts of things because they fulfill the idea of what's going to be valuable. And then of course there's the element of the fact that they're going to be sold. Now the case with Niven. So when Niven finds these things, and he did find them in the ground. Like there are other archaeologists that visited and said they saw him digging them out of the ground. And now how they got there, we can talk about. But when he's pulling them out of the ground, where was I? I'm sorry, I lost my train of thought. Where he was pulling them out of the ground.
And he was witnessed by, for instance,
right.
Thomas Gann and Thomas Morley.
Sylvanus Morley, Franz Blom, and Thomas Gann. Now, Thomas Gann, he had a whole other reputation for not being like another one of his friends was F. Mitchell Hedges, the crystal skull guy who bought his crystal skull in London and then later didn't talk about that he bought it. and let people believe he had somewhere found it. And he seems to tell a whole lot of tall tales. I love the fact that, just completely aside, I've been researching Mitchell Hedges recently, and he talks about riding with Pancho Villa and getting all these scrapes in Mexico. Thomas Gann talks about the fact that Mitchell Hedges didn't have enough Spanish to hire workers, which is kind of hilarious. Yeah, that surprised me. I was reading it and I'm like, really? Like, I didn't necessarily believe he had done all the things he said, but when I read that, I'm like, are you kidding? But anyway, when these things came out of the ground, Niven had been digging in that area for years. I mean, he was digging vast amounts, but not him. He would go out to the dig site in the larger. Now, Azcapotzalco is basically part of Mexico City, but at the time it was more on the outskirts. He ran his store in Mexico City proper 6 out of 7 days of the week. On Sundays, he would go out there. He would call it like my great pleasure to help with the dig. But the digs were continuing when he wasn't there. And he was getting shipments in. I mean, this really was kind of almost industrial in scale, where artifacts of all sorts were coming to him. And in his letters, he's like, I just received another, and I think this is why it says in our notes 169, I just received another 135 stones or 160 stones from these, in addition to other kinds of artifacts. So it's not, there are pictures of Niven digging, and he did, but the vast majority of stuff that came out of the tens of thousands of tons of earth that he moved, he didn't touch. And he wasn't visually there. He wasn't personally there to visually watch all of this. So a lot of the people at the time, when these were coming out of the earth, like the other archaeologists who were more professionally trained in archaeology and who had some background, a lot of them were like, didn't think he had hoaxed them, but assumed that the various farmers and other people he hired and whose land he rented had hoaxed him. And there actually are other examples of this. I've had people try to do that to me. Like I've actually, when I've been working in El Salvador, I've had people more for like to break things up or for mood say like, oh, we found this thing. And then they clearly would have been something they had just scratched with like a trowel. Like just recently had found a rock and like it just carved like a little design on it. And it's clearly the dust is still on it. And in fact, when Franz Blom, so Franz Blom was the head of the Tulane University's Middle American Research Institute, he actually said that when he saw the stones, when he visited in 1925, I could have that date wrong, but it's right around then. He's like, the paint still looks like it's not even dry, and he would like blow on it and like flecks would fall off. So that's what Blom thought of them, but he then saw them coming out of the ground. So the other thing is Morley. So Morley was heading up or organizing the Carnegie Institute's dig in the Maya region. Maya archaeology had begun before that, but that provides much of the backbone for what follows in a lot of Maya archaeology in the 20th century. Morley would have been considered one of, if not the biggest expert in Maya hieroglyphs in the world. And he was initially interested in seeing these things, and after he saw them, he never mentioned them again. So he clearly didn't think very much of them. Thomas Gann gives them about a paragraph in a history of Mesoamerica, and he kind of is like, I'm not sure what they are, but they could be interesting. And he would not have known anything about hieroglyphs. So the people of the time didn't think very much of them. And I think everybody kind of pegged his workers. And the only question I think I have is, was Niven in on these things? And I sometimes think he was, but I sometimes think he wasn't, and there's no documentary evidence. Dr. Wicks has found no documentary evidence. It's not like he's found he's looked through the papers of Niven, and it's not like he's found some, oh, ha, 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 we buried these. There seems to be no evidence of that. But Niven at one point, however, did start working with your great-grandfather, James Churchward, and they did collaborate on these. But that was after he had already been finding them.
I didn't think that there was any hoax on the part of my great-grandfather. But
No. I just wanted to make that clear. They were in the press, and Churchward saw them, and then he became interested in them. Yeah, he's not. He's later. Well, the thing is, he becomes the major sort of source for looking at them because Niven never really published them. He talked about them. There were news reports and whatnot, but he never put them out in a publication. And he was reaching not literally the end of his life, but I mean, he was up there in years. And so I think his priorities, he wanted to do a book, but he never made it happen. And so, the vast majority of the designs come from the collaboration with Churchward. But yeah, Churchward only started hearing about them after Niven had already been in the press in various organs, and you have reproduced in your books some of those press art.
Mm-hmm. Having said all that, do you believe that any of the tablets could be real?
I mean, it's impossible to say that any given object is since they're not carbon dated and these are not datable in that sense. But I'll actually say this: sometimes with these kinds of cases, like the Acambro, like the Ica, and I think frankly like the Niven stones, and I think that's the best way to put them is Niven. The numbers actually work against them. If you had shown me one of these, like if one of these had been found once in a dig, I might go, well, that's an interesting thing. Maybe somebody made this in Mexico 3,000 years ago. The fact that you find so many of them, they're so similar, they're found in such dubious circumstances, all of them show the same kinds of lack of damage and so on, and they're only found by one person, does make me think that no, I don't think any of them are. People make all kinds of idiosyncratic things. Like I was saying earlier, if you find something in one place, you'll find something like it elsewhere. But of course, we all did arts and crafts as kids, while you might recognize that as part of like a larger American or Western culture as, guiding what you do, it's your one thing. We've all seen idiosyncratic artworks. But the fact that there are 2,600 coming from one place makes that idiosyncratic. If you're finding that many of anything like that, you would probably expect like, oh, I'm going to find these at another village down the road where they're making these things or something like that. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to find some that are damaged. And I'm going to find some that are this and some of that. The fact that none of that happens puts them all in I don't think any of them are real. So in this case, weirdly enough, the fact that there are so many actually makes it far less likely that they are real. Let me give you an example. I can't even remember what the find spot for this was, but you ever heard of the Phaistos disc? It's from, I think I don't even know if it's from Crete, but it's from the Aegean. Mm-hmm. And it's often pointed at as like this very early possible writing related to later Linear A or Linear B. And I'm not an expert on that stuff. And I've heard people suggest it's a fake, but most people seem to think it's not. But because there's only one, it's actually really hard to talk about. But if you have a whole bunch of a thing, that actually makes it a lot easier. You give me one, you have an anecdote. You give me more than one, all of a sudden it starts to become, something you can compare. And in this case, no. The fact that there are so many of them, and they're only ever found in the excavations directed or related to one person. And that was something I was going to say earlier. In the case of the Ica and Acambro stones, they are literally purchased per. So there's an obvious profit motive. And in Wicks's book, it's mentioned that he was not buying them necessarily by the stone, but he was paying people to work these lands, and he was renting them from the families that was doing so. And they had been doing this for years. So even if it's not a literal 5 pesos per stone relationship or something like that, I'm just pulling a number out. Mm-hmm. There's a clear long-term relationship that would potentially make it make sense that somebody might hoax them, and I've actually talked about this. I've gone back and forth, and especially when I was all Niven faked them and all that. One motive would be that he had been getting into it with Manuel Gamio, the head of Mexican archaeology. Gamio didn't like that he's selling all these real artifacts. And also Niven was saying all kinds of strange, unusual things. He's like, oh, these figurines come from here, from China, or these come from here, and all this stuff. It's things that we now know are not true. And I think Niven was just wrong. This is archaeology in its infancy, and this to some degree, although not quite so infancy, because Gamio knew what he was doing, and others did. And Niven actually believed that Gamio had been using his government influence to cause him all sorts of problems. And they also argued about the idea of there being a super ancient civilization or very old civilization in the Americas, with Gamio having something closer to the mainstream that, oh no, people came by relatively recently over Siberia. And Niven didn't really believe that in the same way. If Niven did fake him, he actually had reasons to kind of show up Gamio. And again, whether he did or not, that would make some sense. Alternatively, if he was not in on it, it would have made him very happy to find something very, very cool. I mean, if I was digging and somebody's like, oh, I found hieroglyphs, I'd be ecstatic. And then I'd start to see these and go, oh,
it would also motivate his diggers.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Please stay at my place and dig.
Yeah, well, I don't think that was the problem. I mean, this is Mexico during the Revolution. And this is, again, this pattern that you see of somebody coming in from the outside, either from outside the country, like in the case of Valdemar Userul with the Acambro figurines, or from a wealthier background, not in a rural area, like the doctor, whose name I can't remember right now, though I could pull it up, in the Ica Stones, coming in with a bit of money to a fairly not wealthy rural area. And Cabrera, Dr. Javier Cabrera in Peru. And paying people. And I will tell you, having worked in Latin America, in Mexico, and in El Salvador, if you're like, hey, we need to hire a number of people to help do this, you will never get less than what you're looking for. Any number of people will show up looking for work. Mm-hmm. It's just a reality. I mean, and Mexico, and you find the same thing in United States. I mean, that's how labor markets usually work. And in the midst of the revolution, in the 1920s, although it was getting towards the latter part of that, I have to think that it would not have been hard to find people to rent land. It would not have been hard to find people to sell their time and their labor, especially since the boss isn't even there most of the week and he's finding cool things. So yeah, it's I don't think that was a big issue. So no, that wouldn't surprise me at all. The other thing is that Niven, one of his reports that he made, and it does seem to be something he actually said. I at one point thought it was something that he did not say. And I know there's this one newspaper article that you've reproduced that we can't track down the exact date or anything, but where he's talking about finding copper, and not finding copper, finding gold and silver working and all these things 10,000 plus years ago, or thousands and thousands of years ago, that just doesn't make any sense. And secondly, if you were finding such things, why wouldn't you photograph it? And we know he had access to that because there were photographs of him working. Mm-hmm. So I have to admit, I'm not crazy impressed by some of what's coming out of the reports that Niven. So he found real artifacts because they're everywhere. But I have to admit, I look a little askance at some of the things that he wrote about, and maybe some of that was out of his hands and was being puffed up by other people. But all of these combined things, and the other thing I think that your listeners may or may not be aware of, or if they are, they may not be entirely so. This sort of thing was really common at that time. Like it was hard to throw a rock and not find somebody carving fake hieroglyphs into a rock that would then get thrown. I mean, it was very, very common. Hoax artifacts were left, right, and center. We mentioned the Acambro figurines. We mentioned the Ica. They're actually later, but one that's going on almost at the exact same time, and is almost the same sort of thing, is the infamous Glozel, and I don't know how to pronounce that because I don't speak French, but it's Glozel, Glozel, affair in France, happening at pretty much the exact same time, with a very similar sort of thing. Somebody found something in a context that didn't really seem all that unusual, but then they start to find all sorts of strange carved objects that make no real sense and look kind of fake. and it's an outsider who doesn't know a lot about archaeology. Then they find a sympathetic voice. Then it blows up in the media. And in the case of Glozal, it actually became a huge affair. And all the top archaeologists came out there and were like, this is a fraud. And actually, at one point, they proved it was a fraud. They buried a bunch of corkscrews they were given by local community leaders. Yeah, they were trying to pump up tourism, and they buried them at the site. And the people digging, who said, "Oh, our methods are perfect," found them and didn't realize until they realized what they were, that they had been planted. So clearly, they could not differentiate that what a fraudulent deposit. But these sorts of things were happening all over the world, and especially in the Americas. There was a lot of it in the Americas, but they were happening in Europe, they were happening in Africa, in Asia. Early on in archaeology, it was a lot easier to hoax archaeologists for technical reasons, for reasons that they didn't entirely know what they were fully doing yet in many ways. And so it was far more common. You don't have as much of that today because one of the co-hosts on the podcast I mentioned, Archaeological Fantasies, I have, Kenneth Fader, he makes a big point. You can hoax an artifact. You can even hoax a whole bunch of artifacts. But hoaxing an archaeological context is very, very difficult.
I thought the word he used was impossible.
He has used the word impossible. The only reason I would say, I'm not saying I would agree, except that there's this case, and I don't know the details very well, of this, and he ended up committing suicide. This Japanese archaeologist in the 1980s, I want to say, who became very famous, and he found all these amazing sites, and they ended up being hoaxed. And now, in that sense, he actually hoaxed sites. Mm-hmm. But he was the archaeologist, which kind of gives him a sort of a leg up. So I guess that could be sort of the exception that proves the rule. But otherwise, yeah. Because we spend so much time looking at soil stains and minor little differences, it is very difficult. And Ken said it's frankly impossible. And I would not disagree, except for if the archaeologist is kind of in on it, mm-hmm. which is, I don't think, really what he was talking about. So, yeah. I would agree. But earlier on, it was a lot easier because a lot of archaeologists were, Thomas Gann mentioned earlier. So the three people who saw Niven's excavations, archaeologists, Sylvanus Morley, he did do digging, but he was a hieroglyph guy. Like, he would pay chicleros, guys who would go get chicle gum, basically cowboys and sort of rustler types, in the forests of Guatemala. He would pay them to tell where there were monuments, and then he would take them there. He's paying $25 American, which then was a lot of money, especially there. He was an archaeologist, but he had done dirt archaeology. So he's a dirt archaeologist, but still, it was kind of in its infancy. Thomas Gann, he talked about stratigraphy. He was a medical doctor. He talked about stratigraphy, but his methods, he was of the dynamite and pickaxes school of archaeology. Oh. At a point where that was not really as well accepted. And he talks about that, but he was criticized, and he was seen as a guy who would core the hell out of pyramids. He would just, tear giant holes to get at. Now, he would record. He would say, oh, there was a level this and there was a level that. So he wasn't looting in that sense, but his records were not up to snuff of even the day. Mm-hmm. Blom was also an archaeologist, although I've read some of his early stuff. And again, he was not the highest archaeological technician. He was an honest guy. He had drinking problems, which is a whole other issue, which is in New Orleans is not hard to happen. But he was an honest guy. But yeah, that stuff does not read like even the archaeology you see 15, 20 years later, or by some people at the time. And so, given that none of them ever really wrote about these things again, I think they probably saw him coming out of the ground and were like, all right, I'm just gonna keep on keeping on doing what I'm doing and let that go. Which seems to be how most of them treated Niven. The American Museum of Natural History, for example, more or less dropped him like a hot rock. Like, he had been made a 2-time lifetime member because he had found stuff for them in West Mexico. And when this happened, they were just like, sir, here's your rocks back. Thank you for sending them. That was pretty much once they saw them, that was sort of the reaction. Mm-hmm. So, and I know Bob Wicks basically, and he says some of the same things. Sort of thinks more or less that about them. Um, Although again, his book speaks for themselves. And I don't know if I entirely agree, but no, I don't think he was finding these as real. And other things he was finding were real. So the question, and he had also been fooled before. Either he had lied before or he had been fooled before. There was a paper that a friend of Niven's gave using Niven's data that was going to be an important chronology of the Valley of Mexico. And when that came out, it got the scrutiny that a paper like that should get. Like, oh, that's really cool. And a number of archaeologists pointed out, wait, a bunch of these are fakes. Like he had been fooled or had used fake artifacts before. And he actually was like, oh, I will pull these out of the paper. I'll destroy them. But there was a precedent that his work clearly had this issue beforehand. So you kind of stack all of that up, and you stack up the context that this was actually quite a common occurrence in archaeology at that time, and it stops being one after about 1930, and especially after World War II. Although there are exceptions, there are some exceptions, and some of the ones we mentioned are actually after that period. Yeah, that's kind of how I come down on them. But like I said, the chemical testing didn't get us there. And that's not a surprise. I mean, if they were made by his workers and the people working at the site, they would have used the material that was around. So that's not a big surprise. I was hoping for another result to show me something that was a slam dunk and says just like, oh, okay, well, they were probably just made locally, made of local materials that were not inexpensive, didn't cost a thing except for time and labor. So yeah, that's I think kind of where I fall down on. I wish I had some more. And I am going to be potentially examining. Like I said, there's a couple others I've identified in museums, but I have handled the paperwork on one of them. I have not handled anything on the other one. I need to get with the curator on that. And until I handle the other one, I don't really want to speak to them. But the more of these we get, the more we'll be able to understand them and sort of be able to do them. Now, I'll be publishing all of this stuff as a chapter in a book I'm about to finish writing, thank God. It's been a while, with the University of New Mexico Press that is tentatively titled Spooky Archaeology. And it's all about these sorts of topics. And in that chapter, I also look at the history of Mu as a concept. Like, where does the idea come from? So I talk about Augustus and Alice Le Plongeon and Brasseur de Bourbourg, and the almost certainly fictional Paul Schliemann, and how we sort of follow this Mu idea through, and other related concepts, and how it's part of a larger sort of romanticizing of the Maya, and also some other ideas. But yeah, that will be coming out at some point, probably in about a year and a half, and I may be doing some things with it more close in time, not more recently. That's the wrong way, but sooner in the future. We'll see. But yeah, it will be published with those materials, and I'll have the pictures, and I should be able to publish also like scans of the paperwork that go with ours. And I don't think we'll publish like the straight up XRF or X-ray diffraction data, because it's just not terribly interesting, although maybe to make an appendix or something. Well, I'll talk to the press about that. If it was going to be more interesting, we were going to put it out as a separate technical article, but right now it's sort of just doesn't really say anything terribly interesting, and I'm not sure a journal would bite for that. So, but that had been when we thought it was going to be potentially more intriguing. That was actually the plan, was to go that way. But yeah, so I'm going to follow up on these, and I may actually be able to visit one of those museums I mentioned and handle some of this stuff firsthand later this year. And I'd love to be able to get back with you if there's any details I'm able to talk about with that. But since it's not my institution, I always have to be courteous and hey, I don't want to talk out of school about somebody else's stuff.
Understood.
Yeah. So this has this been kind of like a fascinating kind of journey for you, sort of looking into all of this stuff?
Well, yeah, just reconnecting with my family, because
Uh-huh.
from a long time, since I was a kid, people have asked me what I thought about my great-grandfather's works
Right.
and what I had to say about it. Well, my father was very opinionated. He knew his wife,
Uh-huh.
my great-grandfather's wife, and actually
Right.
spent quite a bit of time, and she did not have a high opinion of him. And so whatever he passed down
Uh,
to me was very negative.
but of course,
And
as you said, there's a family or there's a personal bias, but nonetheless, yeah.
and he told me he wouldn't even keep books in the house and talk about it at all.
Yeah.
And when I reached a point where I had seen a few things, and I said, "What the heck?" And I started to look at it, but I decided to take a nonpartisan view. If I
Yeah.
wasn't, I was going to throw out the bias and look at it
Just
objectively.
try to investigate. It's really funny you say that because what you just described is actually fairly similar, if I would say, to the trajectory of I have a volume I've added with the University of Alabama, Lost City Found Pyramid, coming out later this year, and this is not talked about in there other than minorly. Like there's like a paragraph just sort of alluding to this stuff, this specific thing, but the larger picture. And but the one of the chapters I worked on in that, we talk about the history of how archaeology, like professional archaeology, academic archaeology, has responded to some of these more extreme claims. And there's a trajectory. Early on, like we were talking about, when archaeology is just getting kind of its legs under it and figuring out what it is and learning its techniques, it was very much part of the field. Like these sorts of things had to be taken very seriously because we weren't sure what was the situation and what wasn't. So if somebody's like, "Hey, I found things," if in 1900 somebody says, "Hey, I found things from Egypt in Mexico," while probably not likely, there was not enough known to say, well, that's clearly not possible. And so people would investigate it. And so there was a lot of what I call this initial engagement where specialists would very seriously go and like, is this true or not? When archaeology professionalized in about the middle of the 20th century, well, it starts earlier than that, but it really finishes the job by about 1950, 1955. They want to get away from it. They're like, I don't want to talk about any of this. I don't want to talk about how any number of archaeologists that were otherwise well thought of had elements of this in their background. They don't want to talk about how so many of these exist. They're just like, nope, 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 wash my hands, don't touch it, don't dignify it, don't talk about any of this, even though it's what the public thought of what we do and all that. That has begun to change. I think some people in my field, and many of the contributors in this volume all feel this way, realize that one, this is just fascinating stuff. But two, it's kind of part of our family history in a metaphorical sense. Like, this is what people think we do in many cases. Again, if you turn on TV or you look on the internet, this is the stuff that, goes viral. And secondly, it is actually why a lot of early archaeologists got into this. For example, a classic one, Sir Flinders Petrie. He was the first really scientific archaeologist to work in Egypt. There were people that had worked in Egypt before him that had worked on, hieroglyphs and writing and history, and they were all very scholarly and they were accurate. But he was the first one who was like, hey, I want to work on earlier, like before writing, like, the before the pyramids, anywhere from 100,000 years ago to like, say, 5,000 to 6,000 years ago. He was the first one to do it scientifically. And he first went to Egypt because his father was friends with the royal astronomer of Scotland, who believed that you could read Bible prophecy in the measurement of the inches inside the pyramid. And so Petrie went there to investigate that. He ended up believing it wasn't true, but that's why he started. Mm-hmm. So there is very much this same sort of, this is part of our family history. I mean, I mentioned Tulane University earlier, Franz Blom. Franz Blom, a lot of the students even think he was the first head. He wasn't. The first head was a guy by the name of William E. Gates, not the Microsoft guy, and I don't think he's related, but William E. Gates, maybe he is, I don't know, who was looking for Atlantis. He was a theosophist. He was actually, he lived at was it the Loma Linda or the Punta Linda, whatever it is in California, the Theosophy colony. He was a printer there. He was fully into that. And he was looking for Atlantis. And I don't mean metaphorically. I mean like in a literal physical sense. And he was an expert to some degree. And he had a bunch of Maya books and he was kind of a librarian of that. That was the first director of the place where I got my degree. Now, the people who followed him didn't do that. But I didn't know that. I had no idea why I was there. And I don't think it puts, the university in any bad light or anything. It's just what was happening at that time. And I think we need to look more at those sorts of things in the present and the past, but from, like, as you said, not like a nonpartisan. I think of it from like a sociological or anthropological eye. Like, look at these as cultural phenomenon, as history. One, they're fascinating.
Absolutely. That's one reason why I really like diving into the history of how the thoughts changed and where they came from.
Yeah, I have a lot of work over the next 6 weeks to finish this book up. I'm already over my word limit, so a lot of the work's going to be cutting and whatnot. It's work, but I mean, it's fun. I mean, it's fascinating. Two, it's important, I think because so many people think that's what we do and that's what they think about the past. And three, I think it's actually important from how do we engage with the past? So it's kind of an archaeology of archaeology. And so I think it's very important to grapple with these things as long as you are going to be, I'm going to be honest. I'm going to follow where all the evidence, including the historical evidence and the archaeological evidence and the chemical evidence, physical evidence, whatever it is, leads you. And so what I see now going on is this new engagement that people... we mentioned Mitchell Hedges earlier in the Crystal Skull. There are archaeologists who have now taken those, and they found A, the historical documents that show he bought it in London from a guy by the name of Burney. B, they've looked at them with scanning electron microscopy and compared them to known crystal objects or obsidian objects found in actual Mesoamerican sites where we know it's real, and seen that the techniques differ wildly. And in one of those cases, they even found an early 20th century lubricant, an artificial compound on one of those crystal skulls, which pretty much says everything that needs to be said. Mm-hmm. It wasn't from, Zeta Reticuli. It was from some machinist's toolkit in like 1905. So, but they answered the question. They, rather than just ignore it, they went and answered the question, but they did it not just in it's fake, but like, what does this tell us about what we thought about the Aztecs and the Maya? What does this tell us about what we thought about our past? And I think you can do that. And like I said, my chapter in this volume coming out, or in my own book coming out, will kind of do this with the Niven stones, and to some degree. But I think that's a very valuable part of what we do.
Thank you very much for your time. I really appreciate all the information and the update on these fantastic archaeological discoveries now that they are real artifacts being...
Oh, yeah. Yeah, they do exist. It's just what they are is the whole other problem.
Right. So is there anything else you want to add or tell us about your future research plans?
No, like I said, I have these various things. I have a number of different things on these sorts of topics coming out of the pipe. Like I said, there's the Lost City Found Pyramid book coming out, and there's Spooky Archaeology, so I'm almost finishing. I continue my work in El Salvador on both some classic Maya stuff and on colonial. I just sent out an article yesterday that I've been dragging my heels on for a little bit. Finally got that done. Working with pottery. One thing I am increasingly interested in. So you mentioned I sent you 3D print copies of these. Mm-hmm. I'm working increasingly with 3D scanning and printing, and something I actually would like to take some time to do this fall, and I've not had time. Very graciously, the National Museum and the Secretaría de Cultura de la Presidencia de la República de El Salvador, basically the people in charge of the archaeology in El Salvador, they very graciously gave me permission in 2013 to borrow a few of the potsherds, the colonial things from the first San Salvador that I did for my doctoral work. I borrowed them, brought them up to my lab, 3D scanned them, and then returned them to El Salvador. And I highly thank them for that. And I have those 3D scans. One of the things I'd like to do with that is I'd actually like, since they're all broken, as real archaeological artifacts actually are usually, these are parts of plates. They're made, and again, this gets back to what an actual colony of like a sort of empire from across the sea looks like. They're made in a Italianate style. They're copies of maiolica, like sort of like copies of porcelain that are made in Europe at this time. And they're made, however, in El Salvador. They're not maiolica. They're just local pottery, but the form is like that in Europe, and it's highly datable. Like you can easily tell dates with them. And I'd actually like to recreate the plates in toto. So rather than just have a fragment, since I've 3D scanned a lot of them, I want to sort of get into a CAD program and kind of use them to reconstruct the entire plate and print a bunch of them out. Just to be kind of a cool little project, sort of experimentally reconstructing artifacts from fragments. And other people have done this sort of stuff, but I'd like to do that with these. And so that's one thing I'd like to be doing this fall, kind of playing around with some of the 3D stuff. I have some other things I'm working on. And then, frankly, I still have a bunch of artifacts in our basement here, and I'm always being confronted with new surprises. So I'm not expecting to go down and find, something from the lost city of Atlantis in the basement. But given the track record, it wouldn't be entirely astonishing.
Excellent.
Yeah.
So, again, thank you very much, and we'll be looking forward to hearing
Yeah.
from you again.
Thank you for having me on, inviting me on, and this has been a pleasure.
Thank you, sir.
All right. Bye.
Bye-bye. Thanks for watching. My Mu signifies that this is my research into the lost continent of Mu and theories of ancient advanced civilizations. These podcasts are created on an as-needed basis, but you can catch more information reading the my-mu.com blog or visiting the my-mu.com website. Thanks for joining me on this voyage of discovery.